on this episode.
Hello Wargamer. So, after my last video where I was challenged to paint a display piece in a very short amount of time, a lot of friends started asking me how they could improve their painting or they could speed up their painting, because I was able to accomplish a very decent miniature, at least for my standards, in a very short amount of time. So when they took a look at it, like in real life, they started asking me questions on how they could improve their painting. And well, I realized that there was always a question that I had, which was why a lot of people backed away from large army wargames, like wargames where you need 50, 100 miniatures per side to play decently. And when you look around, a lot of people back away from those games, and it's usually because they don't want to paint, or one of the reasons is because they don't want to paint a large amount of miniatures or that amount of miniatures. And I never really understood why. And when I was talking to some friends who I thought that they had this miniature painting thing locked down, I realized that most of them don't have a set process or like a breakdown of the steps that you need to paint your miniatures. Like, they don't have that in place, so they struggle every time that they start a new army project because they don't know how to follow like the core components of every miniature painting project that you will ever have. So I'm gonna explain to you which are those 4 steps, which are pretty simple. They are applying base layers, like understanding which are going to be the dominant colors of your miniature and applying them well. Then doing some sort of highlight. This can be done usually using different techniques. In this video we're going to do a dry brush, which is a very basic technique. And then modulating the colors. Again, this can be used using many different techniques like layering, stuff like that. And we're gonna use the most basic modulating technique that we have available, which is just painting with washes. You'll learn that later. And in the end, it's just painting accents, maybe re-highlighting something that you really want to pop up. Like, all miniature painting, it can be like reduced to those 4 steps. I mean, when you get to like a really complex project, those 4 steps may have many sub-steps in between, but pretty much that will essentially give you a finished miniature, those 4 steps. So what I want you is to understand this on this video, and I really need your help because I'm not sure if I accomplished that. This is the first time that I explained like this process thoroughly, and well, if there's any part of this process that you don't really understand or that you would like me to go further into, please leave it in the comments. I'm new at this, so it's gonna be really helpful if you tell me, you know what, I didn't really catch that, or please explain this further. And well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video.
Welcome, Wargamers. Understand the composition.
So the first thing that I want you to start practicing is that when you look at a miniature, you look at the components that are part of the miniature instead of the miniature itself. And in this tutorial, we're going to be painting United of Progressive People's Soldier from the Papsikels line. If you like the miniatures, the links are going to be in the description. And I just wanted to paint it because it's amazing. Just look at it. It's Cosmonaut mixed with some tactical aesthetics. and I love that. And more than that, I wanted to demonstrate that, well, the internet is filled up with tutorials on how to paint Space Marines, but when you take a look at those two miniatures, the UPP guy and the Space Marine, they really are the same miniature. They're composed of the same stuff. In this case, the UPP guy is made of a primary color, which is green, with a secondary color in black, the weapons in metal, and some accents with the bone and the star. So really, the Space Marine is the same. It's a blue as a primary color with gold as secondary colors, and some accents in brown for the backs and everything like that. The weapons are in metal, and the accessories are in red. You may consider the backs also an accessory, and the arm brace, which is white, and well, the chapter markings. So really, these two miniatures are the same in terms of components. A tutorial to paint one of them should serve you to paint the other with no issues. You would just have to adapt the color scheme a little bit. But this is something that I want you to practice. If you learn how to paint something, it should serve you to paint something else that has the same components without issue. So if this isn't really clear, let me know. But if you learn that, you will learn how to paint everything much faster.
Base layers.
So the first step with these miniatures is going to be adding the primary color, which is going to be green, and brown, a flat brown for the base. And as you can see, I don't usually prime my miniatures because they are resin, they are 3D printed, and they don't really need primer per se. And also I mix my base paints with an adhesive medium, and that allows me to don't really use a primer. So that's what you're seeing here. Now, the main advice that I would give you as a beginning painter is to decide on a paint scheme that is going to use the least amount of colors that you can get away with. In this case, these miniatures were painted with about 6 different paints, and that was about it. Because remember, we're painting for wargaming. So we're gonna be painting 5, 10, 15 of these guys, and usually you want for them to look a little bit uniform, but you don't want a crazy paint scheme that takes a lot of steps, because they're gonna become very, very tedious to paint very quickly. If you're trying to paint a general, a commander, and you have to use 30 paints, it doesn't matter really, because you're gonna paint 1 or 2 of those guys. If you're trying to paint your main battle line with like 13, 20 colors, it's gonna be a nightmare very quickly, and you're gonna be one of those guys who is always running around with an army, always gray, always white, just in primer, because you're gonna get bored with that same paint scheme, and it's gonna become just tedious to paint instead of being a joy because you're accomplishing something in an evening, in a couple of hours. It's gonna become a nightmare because you're gonna dread just taking them step by step. So that would be my first advice as a beginner. Don't overthink your color schemes. Try to do something basic, a couple of brown, a couple of greens, a little bit of skin color, and that's gonna be enough for your first miniatures. You're gonna have good looking miniatures if you follow this tutorial, and it's gonna be done with the least amount of paints that we can get away with. If you have questions about this, how you can decide a color scheme, leave it in the comments. I'm ready to answer all your questions.
How to dilute your paints.
And we're gonna take a little break from the UPP guy because I wanted to show you a little method that I use to ensure that you learn how to dilute your paints. Because it's an advice that you hear on the internet all the time. Dilute your paints, thin your paints, everybody tells you that. But they don't tell you really how to do it. So as you can see, I took a little bit of the barbarian flesh that I have right there on the palette. It's a regular palette. I'm not using my wet palette for this because I want to show you how the paint reacts to just different mixing techniques. For example, at the beginning I just I added moisture to the brush to ensure that I had enough. I use brushes that are designed for watercolor painting, and those are the ones that I recommend you to get. So I just added enough moisture to the brush so that when I mixed the paint on the palette, it gave me a consistency that I wanted. And right now I'm doing the same thing. I'm just taking a little bit of paint with a wet brush. And I need you to pay attention to the way I load the brush with paint. As you can see, I only take paint with the very tip of the brush. The reason I do this is because it allows me more control over the paint, and it ensures me that if I need to paint a very thin detail, that the paint will go where I want it to go, and if it goes where I don't want to, it will not make a mess. So practice that, and that will automatically give you better brush control. Try that. And this exercise, the reason I painted the faces with a pencil is because I'm trying to get the consistency that I want on the paint, where the opacity of the paint blocks the smiley face from showing with just a couple of layers. Usually I try to do just one layer to cover whatever I want, with a layer that is thick enough to cover what is below it, but not too thick so that it covers the detail of the miniature. And with a little bit of practice, you can do it as well. I just learned to do it this way because it saves me time. If I have to do the famous 2 coats, it's another step that I have to add to my process, and I would rather spend that time photographing a miniature, just painting another miniature, or finishing faster. So this exercise, keeping a sheet of paper next to your painting station and just drawing lines with your brush before you actually take it to your miniature, will ensure that you improve better your brush control, you improve faster your brush control, and it will allow you to understand how your paint mixes. And when you go to different brands of paint, different colors, it will allow you better understanding of the paint before you apply it to your miniature and cover a lot of detail or mess it up in some other way. So right at the beginning, I would advise you to do it. It's a good exercise that I was taught, and I recommend it wholeheartedly. So now we go back to the miniature that I was painting, and I'm gonna do uniform. I'm gonna try to do it in just one go, cover everything that I need to cover in just one go, and make sure that the straps, the gloves, everything that has some detail where the green and the black are next to each other, whenever I'm painting the black, that I don't go or spill over to the green part. So that will save me time whenever I'm trying to do any corrections or anything, because mistakes will happen, will always happen. You're gonna always make mistakes. You can't paint perfectly. That you can see me correcting some mistakes there. So when I'm painting the black, I'm trying to paint it as clean as I can, loading the brush with just the amount of paint that I need, and going back to the palette as much as I need to, because I'm trying to be as clean as possible. And just try to do it in one layer, just one go, where I get a good enough cover with enough opacity of the paint so that I don't have to go back and do another layer. And with a little bit of practice, you can do it as well. Now, be mindful that this is not a technique that I would recommend if you're trying to enter a painting competition or a painting contest or something like that. This is something that I developed just to paint the most miniatures in the least amount of time with a good result. So if you're trying to win a golden demon, I don't recommend this. But if you're trying to get your minis on the table, this is what I would do. This is how I do it. So take a look at it. Right now you're seeing me paint the accents in basilisk brown because the original idea was for those parts to be yellow to make a contrast with the red and give it a very, very Soviet vibe. But in the end, I didn't really like how they contrasted. There were two warm colors like clashing against each other. I didn't like the way it looked. So I changed my mind and I did a bone over the accents with just the details of the star painted in red, of the stars, the one in the head and the one in the armband. So I really like the bone more, but in the end it worked out because the basilisk brown was a good vase for the bone to get a yellowish color that I liked. And this was actually a change that I made on the fly. I like the end result, and this is what I wanted to keep on the video. On the beginning I wasn't gonna explain that. I was just gonna show where I painted it bone, but it's really important for you to see that mistakes will always happen. You will have to make adjustments to some color schemes. In the end, try to keep them simple and try to keep them as straightforward as possible. So once more, you don't have to go through 1,000 steps to just paint one guy. And this is really a picture that I took with just the base layers finished. And what I wanted you to see here is that, I mean, these miniatures look pretty defined. I wouldn't consider them finished, but this is what I visualize when people say battle ready miniatures. This is the bare minimum that you can do to a miniature for it to look decent, for it to look decent on the table. When you're trying to do a battle ready miniature, you're not looking for a Golden Demon winner, but you're also not looking to a miniature that is just painted one color with no accents, no secondary color, nothing. The only thing that I would do to these miniatures for them to be battle ready would be to paint the stars in red, and these guys would be finished off in half an hour. 3 of these guys would be finished in half an hour. So really this is just to emphasize that you don't need to be that guy with an internal white army. You can just do this, which is the bare minimum for your minis, and they will look good. Well, maybe not good, but they will look decent and they will make for a better experience wargaming, and you can always go back and start improving on them when you have more time or when you want to, or when you feel confident enough to actually do the next steps. So try it.
Dry brushing.
So right now I'm preparing my paint to do a relatively heavy dry brush. And in this case, I'm not using my wet palette because I want to do a dry brush. So anything that would dilute the paint would get in the way of the result that I want. And I'm going to be using relatively light gray that will accentuate the black and the green. And you will see the end result later when we follow to the next step. So the dry brush technique is relatively straightforward. We're going to be using a flat brush, and we're going to be loading the brush only by the tip, like with very minimal amount of paint. And then we're going to remove most of that paint from the brush by rubbing it against a piece of paper, a piece of cloth, or whatever we have available, so that when you pass the brush, it only leaves a small amount of paint. Now, what we're doing here against the miniature, it's relatively heavy, so we don't want to remove a lot of paint from the brush, because what we want is for a relatively high amount of paint to be left on the details of the miniature, but we don't want to paint the miniature per se. We just want to brush it off. That's why the technique is called like that, dry brush. So we just want to dry brush a little bit of paint over the details of the miniature and make sure that they are highlighted very, very quickly. Now, this technique is really something very basic that all miniature painters should know, and something really important that is not often mentioned when this technique is discussed is that this is a directional technique. And what I mean by this is that usually you want the movement of the brush to follow the same pattern, whether it's horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, every time in the same direction, because what you're trying to do is simulate light in a certain direction or manner. So whenever you're doing it, you want to follow where the light would be going. If it's going from up down, you want to follow that same pattern with your brush. If it's radiating around a lamp, you want to follow that same pattern. So whenever you're doing this technique, make sure that you're consistent with your direction, because that's one of the most common mistakes that I've seen, and it's not often mentioned. So be careful with that.
Metallics.
So right now you're looking at me applying the metallics, and as you can see, I apply the metallics very carefully, because I like for the details of the weapon or whatever I'm painting to be really highlighted by the black that it's left on the weapon, the original black. So I really just use the dry brush that we did in the last step as a guideline to apply the metallics where I want them, and I try to not apply them in a haphazard manner. I do them carefully, and I keep the contrast of the black, as I said. Now, this may seem like it takes a lot of time, but in my experience, it actually is faster, because you don't have to apply the metallics, then go back to a wash or whatever else to get the details of the miniature showing again. You're actually just accomplishing this in one step. Just by highlighting the metallics in a very careful manner, you're saving yourself time by not having to go back to a wash or back to re-highlighting later. You just do it in one step.
Painting with washes.
So right after we're done with the dry brush, we're gonna rediscover the base colors that have been highlighted by the previous step. And we're gonna do that with a wash, with a simple wash in the same tone or in a similar tone as the base color that we used previously. In this case, it's a military shader from Army Painter that gives off like a really olive tone to the green. And I love it to just paint military colors, military greens in general, and camouflages, stuff like that. So we're gonna rediscover those colors with a shade. We're gonna use first the green over the green areas, and then we're gonna go back to a black. And the reason that I like this method more than using just the standard slap chop method of just painting over a miniature that is fully white and gray is that I think you can achieve more rich colors than you would otherwise. Usually the slap chop method ends up with a bunch of colors that look kind of pastel or like look too natural to me, regardless of the speed paint that you use. I have tried it in the past, but I don't really like the standard slap chop method that is usually presented. And this is pretty much the same or it's similar, but I've been using this process for years now, and it allows you to finish up a lot of miniatures in a relatively short amount of time, but you end up with a more consistent result and with every part of the miniature exactly differentiated. Because when you start with the white or the gray on the whole miniature, it's really hard for the speed paint to do its job and actually create a contrast between all the miniature elements. When we do it this way, you actually create that during the whole process. Because since we started with different base colors, we are rediscovering those with the washes and actually achieving that contrast. That way, when you look at the miniature from 3 feet away, you can exactly see where the vest starts and the fabric from the uniform starts, where the helmet starts. You can see every element differentiated, and that will go a long way of giving you great looking miniatures, regardless of the time that you have to paint them and the color scheme that you use. Also, it's important to note that on the shadow areas, I'm applying a little bit more of the wash. Once it's dried, I go back and add another layer of the wash wherever I want the shadows to be emphasized. For example, below the vest, on the lower parts of the straps, things like that. So pay attention also to that part of the process. And right here, when I was painting the mini, I noticed that there was a gap between the glove and the uniform, the miniature's uniform. And I don't know why I decided to paint it skin color. I'm not sure the sealed up suit would work that way, but I just wanted some other tone to break down the uniform and the gloves. So what do you think? Does it look good? Does it breaks down the immersion for you? Let me know in the comments. So after that little break to paint the skin on the hands, I'm continuing with the dark tone from Army Painter. That will go all over the metallics that we previously painted and all over the black areas that we did at the beginning. Now, a tip that I haven't mentioned when you're painting with washes is that if you make a mistake, you spill over to a part where you didn't want that color of the wash to go, and you can catch it fast enough, you can actually just use a dry brush, another brush that you have around, and absorb the excess if the wash hasn't dried. So pay attention when you're painting with your washes and just do that. See, I catch that mistake before the wash was dried, and I just absorb the excess with another brush. Like I said, I mean, mistakes are gonna happen, and the way the washes work, you can pick up really easily the excess with a clean brush if you catch it before the wash is dried.
Painting accents.
And pretty much by this point, you can see how the miniature is gonna look once it's finished. Right now, we're only missing the red star and just cleaning up a little bit the parts that are gonna go bone. But otherwise, the miniature is pretty much done, and we did it in a very fast amount of time. I think I spent like 5 minutes per miniature just doing the star because of the size and the detail that it has. And I mean, the miniature has many other details that we could choose to focus on, but I think they're unnecessary to get the result that we want, which is for the soldier to look exactly as it is. And just the red star will make enough difference for it to look iconic without spending that much time on it. So this is another tip, be strategic about which parts of the miniature you want to actually highlight and which parts of the miniature you can live by them looking just regular. Because for example, the miniature has like a little gun at the side, like a side gun, has a knife on its leg, and we could choose to focus on those details, but we will spend a large amount of time and not achieve that much because the miniature would look pretty much the same, at least from a distance. The way we did it, we chose to focus on just the main detail that makes the miniature iconic. For example, if you're painting like a space marine, you would achieve a similar result by just focusing on the lenses and the aquila and just leaving the extra details like the markings of the chapter to be done by the decals. And in reality, this is the final step that will finish up the miniature, and I would advise you just to take a look at it, whatever finished miniature you have, and just verify if there are any mistakes you made during the process, anything that you want to correct or touch up on. But pretty much this is the whole process, and essentially once you have enough experience, you can use this same process for whatever miniature you paint, whether it's a horse, whether it's a soldier, whether it's a space marine, whether it's an alien. It's pretty much the same. You just have to decide on what are going to be the base colors the secondary colors and what are going to be the accents. And once you find a way to apply those in a consistent manner, you will be able to paint whatever you want using these same steps, which is base color, a little bit of dry brush, accents, washes, and then you're done. So I really hope this tutorial allows you to see that painting miniatures is really something easy when you make it a process, and that when you're really clear on what you're trying to accomplish with every miniature that you paint. And if you were or are one of those guys who is always carrying the same gray or white miniatures, that it gives you a little nudge to start correcting that, because there's nothing more unsatisfying than playing against an army that it's made up of incomplete or unpainted miniatures. It takes away from the whole wargame experience. And well, I hope that you get to know your miniatures better, you paint them, you enjoy them, and if there's any technique or anything that you saw in this tutorial that you would like me to develop further or do a whole video on that subject specifically, just make sure to leave it in the comments, and I hope I see you at the table soon.